Okay, everybody. Thank you very much for coming to our session on nonprofits and disruptive innovation. Albert Einstein said, "Only those who attempt the absurd can achieve the impossible." And I think those of us who've been connected with nonprofits, work with nonprofits, know that sometimes the things that we're trying to achieve feel quite absurd, and we're put into very absurd conditions in order to achieve them, in that we might have very limited resources, have to figure out how to garner all the resources and to accomplish very, very big things to change society and to really be there to support society. So today I have panelists along with me, people who have been change makers and working on solving seemingly intractable problems that are some of the biggest ones in our society, some in the Jewish community and the society at large. Nonprofits are on the front lines and work to provide fresh solutions to the social sector's myriad challenges, whether it's improving academic performance of people at risk or cutting the global poverty rate, where we as a world have made a humongous success and have really just cut the global poverty rates in half in a much quicker timeline than we ever would have thought imaginable. It was bold people who thought of these ideas and who were audacious and took them on that have made the difference. When in 1997 I went to Thailand with Doctors Without Borders, I went to see clinics where we were treating people with AIDS, and at that time we were only treating the opportunistic infections, and it wasn't even conceivable that people in poor countries could get treatment. And today, through really the drive, the passion, and commitment of Doctors Without Borders doctors, the whole notion of being able to treat people in developing countries and making it, approaching the problem in innovative ways where you're doing task shifting and having nurses do what doctors do and lay people do what nurses do in countries such as ours. I went to Malawi and Lesotho about 10 years ago, and AIDS in those countries are now being treated as chronic diseases just as it is here in the West. So when you think big and you think bold, we are able to take big social problems and really change the world. So I'm Alyssa Herman. I'm happy to be here today. Throughout my career, I've been able to be on the cutting edge of innovation at Doctors Without Borders, at organizations like most recently at Autism Speaks, where we built the largest genomic database and really are going to bring therapies in the next 10 years to people on the spectrum, both to look at looking at the underlying causes of autism and some of the coexisting conditions that come together with autism. I've had the ability to work with real innovators, and I'm extraordinarily excited to be here at Yeshiva University. I'm the new Vice President of Institutional Advancement, and to bring that same passion and commitment to the next phase of Yeshiva University. When I was at Autism Speaks, one of our board members, Curtis Arledge, who was the past CEO of Bank New York Mellon, told me I had to meet Patrick. And he came back so excited from Stanford and just said this was somebody who was really game-changing. And when someone who was the president, the CEO of Bank of New York Mellon speaks, you know that about innovation, and this is someone who can deliver. It was really important to me to very quickly get to know Patrick, and since then we've had several conversations and hopefully a budding friendship, and I just want to thank you here today. When I asked Patrick what he knew about Yeshiva University, he told me that at Georgetown they really took pride in being a leader in sending students abroad to study for a year, and there was only one university that had more students going abroad for the year, and that was Yeshiva University. So now we're so happy to have Patrick within our fold. Patrick's going to talk today about about a company that he has created to partner and serve nonprofits, which is called FreeWill, which is designed to help nonprofits across every single sector deal with the coming change and wealth transfer that's going to happen over the next years with the boomers, making sure that we're positioned. So not only is he audacious for one nonprofit, he wants to help us all and the whole sector. And when I thought about who is a disruptive innovator, I just had to think of Patrick. And before that, he was the head of innovation and strategy and director of global campaigns at change.org. Again, another group that really is at the forefront of making a difference for nonprofits, all nonprofits. And so you could read the rest of his bio, but I just wanted to call out some of those things that I just thought were just so monumental. So thank you for joining us, Patrick. To my left is Dan Perla, who I can also call a friend. Dan Perla left 18-year career in the financial world as a security analyst and portfolio manager to really become a social entrepreneur and a change agent. And he has, if you look at all the groups that are really trying to do system change for both formal and informal Jewish education, whether it's camping or day schools, Dan has been there on the front lines making a difference. And right now, he has this great title. He's the Director of Financial Vitality at Prizmah. The Director of Financial Vitality.
It was either that or financial insolvency. So
okay.
Yeah.
So in the community that I will not call modern Orthodox, because I know that is no longer a relevant term, knew that before today, but thank Rabbi Sachs for that. That community in the recent study by Nishma and others has cited the cost of Jewish education as one of the biggest problems facing our community. And Dan really has taken it on the front lines. I've had great conversations with Dan on the Metro North Railroad because he always is up in and is on the cutting edge of problems that the Jewish world is facing and on the education line. So happy to have you here today, Dan. And Keshet is a new friend. I said to a few people, who is doing something disruptive, but also in a traditional world? And people said, you have to speak to Ora, and told me about Keshet and her work, because Keshet is working in a traditional society, in a traditional community, and dealing with an entrenched problem of Jewish divorce and its connection to abuse, and doing it on a case-by-case basis. And also, when she's dealing on this, she's dealing on it in a new global scale, because people are moving from country to country. It's new problems that our society and our Jewish society are facing that didn't exist before. And she's using new technologies as a driver to actually solve this problem. So we're so excited to have these panelists here today. And as far as format, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to speak for 5 to 7 minutes. Then we're going to have a discussion and then turn it over to you for some questions. So thank you very much for coming today, and really excited about this conversation. The Bridgespan Group recently did a survey of 145 nonprofit leaders, and the focus was the capacity to innovate, which was defined as a break from practice, large or small, that leads to significant positive social impact. Well, 80% of the organizations aspire to be able to do innovation to solve the social issue that they're confronting. The problem is just 40% of these would-be innovators say that their organizations are set up to do so. So I asked all of you to join us today because you are some of the innovators who are doing it and doing it well. And as the social entrepreneurs and the disruptors who are taking entrenched problems, whether it be in helping nonprofits do their philanthropy or solve a social issue, that's the opening question. And I would like to turn to Patrick as to be our number one presenter. So Patrick, if you can just give us a sense of how you take on this challenge as an innovator and a disruptor to help the social sector.
Sure. It's great to be here. I think, actually, I first want to just mention, in Rabbi Sachs's presentation, there was the idea of the commitment to truth, and it's something that Yeshiva holds up. And the two things that I think really drive, commitment to truth is sort of nice. The two things that I think drive that more than anything are a commitment to curiosity, and a commitment to sort of openness to being wrong. And I think the organizations, there's a lot of dynamics in the nonprofit world that push back against that. You don't want to go to your donors and say, we have this really good idea. It could be a terrible mistake, but we'd really like you to fund it. And it's interesting to see a lot of the organizations shifting around the country in that spirit. And it's sort of a very difficult transition for a lot of folks. But this, speaking with the president of Yeshiva earlier today, and about, the role of ideas is very important. The role of big questions might even be more important. And so we think a lot about that in our own work. In my experience, as Alyssa mentioned, I come from not the Jewish tradition, but a progressive Catholic social justice tradition. In my family, grew up learning about Martin Luther King and Joan of Arc and Mother Teresa and folks like that. When I was in Georgetown in DC in the early part of the last decade, many of you were aware of what was unfolding in the western region in Sudan around the crisis in Darfur at the time, and actually became sort of deeply entwined in an organization called STAND, which was growing very rapidly, and largely through the support of Jewish networks at a campus-by-campus level, and so became very sort of intertwined with the Jewish social justice tradition, and have identified with that strongly as well since. From college, after starting a nonprofit, I went to go run email fundraising for President Obama for about 2 years, and actually got to see Joe Biden on Friday night, and we talked a little bit about this, which was really special. You guys remember the Obama administration? And one of the things, we were running email fundraising, we had 11 million people that we could email. And we created a lot of the best practices in digital fundraising at the time. And it's not because we were any smarter than other people, but we had 11 million people we could test to, and we could try things to 10 or 20 or 50,000 people at a time. And we were actually wrong most of the time. It was a really formative experience for me because we'd say, okay, we think this will definitely work. And then we could actually see the data 80 minutes later, and our success rate of predicting what would work was just slightly higher than a random monkey. Right? It was the people that were the best online fundraisers in the country on this team, and we were wrong all the time. And that built in, I think, a lot of intellectual humility in our work, which made us, was actually a tremendous privilege. I think in small organizations, you just have to say, this works, we're going to do it. And that shifted it. And so from there, I went to change.org, where the premise of change.org is that we took all these tools that nonprofits had, starting petitions, starting social change campaigns, becoming leaders, and handed them out to ordinary people. And the learning there was that helping ordinary people have impact at 1 million or 10 million, or when I left 120 million people, was just so much greater than anything that I as an individual could do. And that shaped my thinking going forward to think, what are the areas where there's tremendous untapped potential from ordinary people that is being held back by something, right? And to me, the key to helping ordinary people have change is, one, providing the tools and processes to make it possible, and two, providing the narrative to help them know that it's possible, right? In the organizing world, you call it helping people unlearn helplessness, which is, I think, a core feeling that a lot of people have in the world today. And when I was in New York, before going to Stanford, where I am now as a graduate student, I spent a lot of time with mentors, with nonprofit leaders, with folks in the space, thinking, what are the areas of untapped good in the world? What is massive potential that's being held back for one reason or another? And unexpectedly came on the concept of planned giving. And some of you may know what that is, some of you not. It is giving around end of life. So through bequests, through trusts, through other things. Bequests are the most common. And a few things that you might not know is that in the next 20 years, there'll be $35 trillion inherited in the United States. This is the biggest wealth transfer in the history of the world by a lot. It's probably the biggest opportunity for philanthropy since the invention of money. And we've been looking through, why is planned giving, which is already about $30 billion a year, why is that not happening at a radically larger scale? And rather than making guesses, we just went out and we interviewed about 200 nonprofit organizations. We interviewed about 200 donors in the baby boomer space and said, what's holding us back? And there's a long article published last week in the Stanford Social Innovation Review that sort of has all of our research, and I won't go through it now. But some of the biggest things are that people hate estate planning. And in fact, the simple process of hating estate planning means that people don't do it, and because they don't do estate planning, they don't give. And when they do estate planning, nobody asks about charitable giving, and that holds back it reduces giving by about 90% when you don't actually ask about it. And so very simple things that have nothing to do with the core message of your nonprofit organization or the underlying motivation of the donor. It's just some simple process shifts. And we've been able to design some tools to help people start their estate plans online in a way that are warm and intuitive and free, And as of yesterday, we've raised about $32 million in new bequests for nonprofits, mostly in the last 6 months, which is really exciting. And it's all, well, with the exception of a small fraction, it's all other people's money, right? It's all just helping normal people do things and helping them believe that they can change the world, that they can have this level of impact. And that's been really special. From individuals, we've heard, A, a sense of relief, because this has always been the last thing on their to-do list that they've never done. But B, sort of a reframing and a sense of purpose around this. I think people imagine estate planning is like doing your taxes, when in many ways it's one of the fullest expressions of what matters most to you and why. So that's what we're working on, and we can talk a bit more about that later.
Dan?
Great. Good morning, everybody. I think it's still morning. Yes. So one of the nice benefits of not being the first speaker is that you get to look at what you prepared and then quickly change it to to shift gears a little bit. But I'm shifting gears really in response not just to Patrick's remarks, but to Alyssa's framing of this as I think it might be very helpful to talk about some of the things I've experienced, some of the specific projects that we've worked on, trying to affect real change, and to spend a few minutes talking about why they didn't work, right? Because there's a tendency to, I used to work in finance, and I was involved with stock selection. And whenever you had a good stock, it was fantastic. The stock was going up. You were writing about it all the time. And I looked at my boss one day and I said, I've got the stock that's really been terrible. What do I do? And he said, just stop talking about it. So I think unfortunately, we have this tendency when engaging in innovative projects when they don't work, and let's be honest, the majority, if not the overwhelming majority, do not work, to stop talking about them as opposed to really trying to dissect and understand what's going on. So I'm going to talk about 3 projects that I've been involved with over the last 4 or 5 years. As Alyssa mentioned, I've had the privilege of working, following a career in finance in the private sector world. I've had the privilege of working in both the Jewish camping fields and in the Jewish day school field. The latter both at the Avichai Foundation and now currently at Prizmah, an entity that was a representative of 5 organizations that merged into one national entity, which maybe if we have 30 seconds at the end, we'll talk about a little bit. So 3 projects. One is a camping, Jewish camp-related project that did not work, but that was a real attempt at real innovation. A lot of my work, because of my finance background, is in the area of affordability. And camps, though relatively inexpensive compared to Jewish day schools, are nonetheless expensive propositions for most families, particularly middle-income families. So in my time at the Foundation for Jewish Camp, we created a project called Bunk Connect. And the concept of Bunk Connect was to take empty bunks at Jewish overnight camps and to fill them by offering a discount. The model was actually based on Hotels.com. And interestingly, or not surprisingly, one of the major funders of this project was a fellow who was number 2 or number 3 to Sheldon Adelson at Las Vegas Sands. He was, in short, in the hotel business. And the concept was, if Hotels.com can be such a profitable model and can offer rooms, hotel rooms, based on availability at a discount, why can't we do the same at Jewish camps? So we spent a significant amount of time, researching the market. We didn't want to just make this a lower price for all families. We wanted to make this a lower price for families that needed the discount. In other words, it was done on a needs basis, and it was targeted toward middle-income families. We spent significant time defining what middle income looks like in various markets of the country. Some of you will probably laugh when I cite incomes up to $300,000, $400,000 in New York or Los Angeles is still qualifying as middle income, but based on the cost of Jewish living, that of course is still, that's middle income. In those markets. Fortunately, there are markets where it's less than that. But the concept was really simple. And we went, after a period of about a year putting this all together, we got dozens of camps to arrange to put certain bunks on, to list certain bunks in their inventory, and to offer what averaged about a 50% discount. And we had several thousand visitors to this website. That may be low, it may be 10,000 visitors to the website, and we were initially really, really excited. The bottom line was, 6 months or a year later, I believe there were 50 some odd or 60 some odd people that had actually registered through this site, right? And one of the things we learned was, number one, parents have a funny way, parents want the camp they want for the spot they want, right? They have an 8th grade girl, they want a particular camp, and it doesn't help that if there's a fourth grade boys bunk in that camp, they have an 8th grade girl. And it doesn't help if there's an 8th grade girl spot in a different camp, because they want the camp they want, right? And so as a result, it simply, it simply didn't work. When last I left, they were still kind of trying to retweak the model, but a really bold, ambitious effort with some interesting learnings, but not quite the magic formula. The second project I want to talk about actually was a project that I did in my days at Avichai, my time at Avichai with YU. We called it the Benchmarking Project, and it was a work that was done with approximately 40 day schools in 5 different regions across the country. And the idea was to work with each day school to achieve 10% budget improvement, right? Much of this obviously was in response to the tuition crisis and the cost of day school education. And it was presumed that most of the opportunity would be on the cost-cutting side. That, in other words, the working hypothesis was the problem with day schools is they're simply too expensive. But we simply framed the project as day schools can work with us if you're prepared to target 10% improvement. That could be any kind of cost-cutting area. By the way, it could also be improved revenue, tuition setting, et cetera. But the assumption going in was cost-cutting. And I think one of the things we discovered is while there were isolated examples of schools that were able to reduce their costs by 10% in one or more areas, for the most part, the schools actually, cost wasn't the real challenge. Most of the schools were actually running pretty lean. They were running lean relative to cost per student of public schools, notwithstanding their dual curriculums. And the schools that weren't running lean were intentionally not running lean, meaning they needed to spend money and invest in educational excellence or in certain departments in order to compete with other private schools or other day schools in their markets. Now, their schools wound up achieving the 10%, but the overwhelming majority did it through increased fundraising, to Patrick's point, tuition setting, endowment, right, things on the revenue side. But I want to highlight this because one of the important learnings that we still try to share with the field is, while there may yet be opportunities right on the cost side, when you do big projects like this, it's very important to share your findings that sometimes you can achieve your goals, but you get there different ways. And I think that's another part of being innovative, is a willingness to say, you know what, this worked, but in a different way than we thought, and not for the reasons we thought, right? Just in very, very briefly, that program, we moved away from that program, and we then created a series of programs which still exist at Prizmah to focus on fundraising and endowment building and filling more seats in tuition. Which leads me into just the last couple of minutes, which is a very innovative endeavor that's going on now, are what we call creative tuition models. These go by different names. You may see schools, and at the moment there are approximately 25% of day schools across the country have a creative or alternative tuition model. Many go by names like flexible tuition or index tuition, sliding scale tuition. One of the most fascinating to me are income cap programs, right? That in an attempt to address the issue of affordability, particularly affordability for middle-income families, there are schools that will cap a family's tuition at a certain percent of their pre-tax or after-tax income. And again, there are about a quarter of schools across the country that have these programs. Are the results overwhelming? Or if the objective, let me reframe it, if the objective is filling more seats, driving more students to day school, have they been successful? Not especially. If the objective is making the burden, easing the tuition burden for families that are already committed to day schools, Orthodox or non-Orthodox, have they been successful? Then I think the answer is yes. So again, probably a good example of programs that, for the most part, set out to drive enrollment, to fill empty seats, didn't necessarily succeed in that, but have other important tangential benefits, such as making day schools more affordable to others. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Keshet.
So Sounds good. Well, I'll start by saying it's always a relief to know we're not the only nonprofit that tries things and realizes they don't work and shift gears. So that's always reassuring. I am Keshet Starr. I'm the managing director at ORA. And what we do is we work on issues of domestic abuse in the Jewish divorce process. So just to give a very brief background, since I know some people are more familiar with this issue than others, in Jewish law, in addition to getting, say, a civil divorce from the state, you also need to get a separate Jewish divorce. And if you don't get the Jewish divorce, which is called a get, you can't remarry. In most Orthodox communities, you can't date. So you're really stuck. You're stuck in this limbo space where you're not married, but you're not single. And it's...
For women, make that clear. Women in that.
Yes, exactly. So it's actually...
Men have a different...
Right. Get refusal can go both ways. Most of our cases are one direction. There are certain Jewish legal mechanisms that are available to men and not women. So there's a lot to say about all of that. But just to kind of put it in a nutshell, we have this situation where sometimes people are stuck in a place where they don't have their Jewish divorce, they can't get the Jewish divorce. The divorce needs to usually come from the other spouse. It can't be given by a rabbi or a religious court or some other third party. And people get stuck, and it's a bad situation to be in. Psychologically, it's a really devastating situation for people to be stuck in. I spoke with a woman a few weeks ago who received her get after 3 or 4 years of battling for it. And she said on the phone, you don't even realize how weighed down you are until that weight is gone. That I didn't even realize how stuck I was until I walked out of the room and this battle was over. So essentially, that's the issue that we're working on. That issue has changed a lot over time. This is something Alyssa mentioned, but really just globalism has changed get refusal in a fundamental way. People are not living in a tiny shtetl in Poland and only hanging out with other Jews, and if those other Jews won't spend time with you, you are really stuck. That's not happening anymore. People are moving from country to country, from neighborhood to neighborhood. They might start out, in a Hasidic community and become entirely not Orthodox. They're moving within denominations, communities, countries, and that's really changing our ability to use kind of community pressure and help people get their gets. So that's the situation we deal with. Prior to ORA's founding, there weren't really any great options for how to handle this. You could work with sort of volunteer advocates who might be charging you an exorbitant sum of money on the side, might be taking advantage of you in all sorts of ways. People will sometimes use illegal mechanisms to encourage their spouse to give them a get, which can obviously land you in federal prison for a long time. It's something we don't recommend at ORA. And there really weren't too many great options. And so we were founded in 2002, initially as a student group here at YU. And the ORA was first founded because a group of students heard about an Agunot case, a situation of a woman who wasn't able to receive her get. They had a rally outside the husband's home. Husband gave the get. And they figured they have a good idea on their hands. They started ORA. Now in 2017, we're actually the only nonprofit organization that is addressing get refusal, not just in terms of education and information, but in terms of case-by-case advocacy. We work on cases worldwide. We work with the Israeli rabbinate on cases, in particular where the husband is outside of Israel. We've actually found, to kind of echo what other people have been sharing today, that the model we started with initially, having a rally outside someone's house and they come out with their hands up and give a get, actually hasn't really been working anymore because we take on cases now after much more of a process. We take on cases that are already usually several years into a messy situation. And we've actually found that what's much more successful is, first of all, threatening the rally more than the rally itself. We get a lot more done in the weeks before the rally than during. And we, instead of using the rally as a sort of come out with your hands up and cooperate, we use it as a way to bring people back into a process. So we first try to create a process, whether it's through a beat in a religious court or through a civil court or through a collaborative law process that we think is going to work with this couple. And we use the rally to reel them into that process rather than encourage them to just flat out give a get, because people in the cases that we're working with now versus the cases we were working with 15 years ago, that just hasn't been as successful. In terms of what we do overall, we really have like 3 primary prongs of our work. We have our advocacy work. We work on about 70 active cases at a time. We when people ask me what we do, it sounds like a bit of a cop-out, but the honest answer is that we do whatever we think is going to work within two boundaries. So civil law, we don't do anything illegal, although we are asked occasionally, and we don't do anything that would be considered a violation of Jewish law that would make the get invalid. Between the two, we do literally whatever it's going to work, whether it's threatening a rally, crafting some sort of a process, social media campaigns, community grassroots activism, in some cases, literally getting someone a puppy so they could have a little bit more positivity in their life and calm down a little bit and not feel as pushed against a wall. Whatever we think is going to be successful, that's what we do. We also have a new program that we actually started based on what we saw wasn't working so successfully. And we looked at our stats and we realized that people were calling ORA on average 3 years after separation. And in those first 3 years of a divorce, a lot of decisions are made. Court processes are initiated. People are retaining attorneys. People are signing arbitration agreements with religious courts that are not overturnable. And people were coming to us 2 years, 4 years, 6 years into a process that was a huge mess, and we were doing the best we could to clean up that mess. But then we started saying, well, what if there's a way we could get people on day one of the divorce or even pre-divorce and not already into this big disaster of a process? So we started a new program called One Step Forward, which is a Jewish divorce helpline. And with that program, we really target people who are thinking about divorce or in the early stages of divorce. And we help them figure out from day one how to structure the process based on their community, their circumstances, their priorities, all of that. And we've actually been really fortunate to see that that actually has really been successful, and we've been able to get people much earlier. That process has also made us aware of a lot of gaping holes in need. So for example, the number one need people have that we have absolutely no way to meet is how to pay for attorneys, especially for people in the middle class who aren't eligible for free legal services. So we've started thinking and talking about, what we can do to help facilitate that. That's not our primary focus. We're really focused on the get, but what can we do to give people, at the very least, the opportunity to come into court and have a fair adversarial process rather than get steamrolled because they're not represented, and then in return that diminishes their power and their negotiating strength, which then impacts the get. So that's sort of a second program that we have. And then finally, we also have education initiatives where we advocate for the standardization of the halachic prenuptial agreement, which is essentially an agreement that a couple can sign before they get married that prevents most get refusal cases later on. And with that, we're always looking at what are the barriers that are stopping people from signing it. Does it feel icky? Does it feel unromantic? Is there something going on? And we're actually working now on something we've never done before, which is actually working with a comedy show on producing an episode that incorporates the prenup to try and introduce the prenup in a way that isn't, dark and heavy and thunder and lightning, but something that's much more normalized, something that normal, healthy couples do, not people who are anxious. And so those are just a little bit about the different projects that we're working on, and I'm really mostly excited to hear more from Patrick and Daniel and Alyssa, but I'm also, of course, happy to answer any questions when we get to that point. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Aren't they great, our panelists? So the global poverty rate, which I mentioned earlier, was cut in half in 20 years, and it's the extreme, people living on less than $1.25 a day, and it's a huge difference for people's lives. And if we've taken it down to 21% in such a short time, why not 1% by 2030? That was what I read on a cover of an Economist headline. Why not 1% by 2030? That's audacious. That's big. And any kind of change that's really big and at scale takes lots of players and little incremental things to make it happen. I just want to ask our panelists, how do you think about your work as audacious? And is the goal to be audacious, or is the goal to really make change, testing out one at a time?
Oh, I will say that I think the answer is yes. Meaning yes to both. I think that in many cases, the reason we're not solving audacious problems is sort of hopelessness that turns into a lack of attention, right? The scarcest resource we have is not time, it's not money, even though it feels like that for most nonprofits. It's the attention. And and the Millennium Challenge goals that Alyssa's talking about that said we are going to cut poverty in half in 20 years, which seemed ridiculous, and then we were wildly successful, was because people were saying, okay, let's do this. If we were to do this, how might we do it? And then, the way you can think about that is what happens, and it actually sounds like when you're describing the Bunk Connect problem, it was like, let's put together a whole system and put it forward and see what happens. Instead of, this was probably the core lesson that it sounded like you learned, which was let's call some families and say, hey, we have this, do you want to buy it? Would you use it? Right. And then you do that, you can do that in 2 days instead of what I assume was a year-long process of funding and technology and network building. And that slowed learning down. And so there's a lot of sort of more pilots happening now around poverty, but also in other areas. Let's say, let's try this in one community as fast as humanly possible. Let's go ask the beneficiaries, would you use this, right? Would you, if day school was suddenly cheaper, would you go or would you buy it? I mean, certainly we would like to pay less. What would that look like? And what are the barriers there? And thinking, okay, if any of that works, let's try it at a medium scale as fast as humanly possible, and then we can scale up. But a lot of times, especially large nonprofits, like to do huge initiatives and announce it, because it's really fun to announce things. I recognize the irony of saying that today, but it sounds like you guys are doing this in a very curious way and the right way. But this, it's the reason that smaller institutions are always more innovative, right? It's because they can go really fast and they have very little risk. Because if they disappear, it's very similar to where they are today, right? They're not achieving anything at the moment, so if they try these big things and it doesn't work, there's no risk. And so what you see is, in successful organizations, is actually splintering, and they say, okay, you 3 people, go try stuff and go figure it out, and we're not going to involve the largest institution, because the more stakeholders you have, the risk increases and innovation usually goes down.
So maybe I'll pivot right up. You've set me up perfectly for this. And I appreciate the question, Alyssa. So the answer I'll also say is yes and yes. As working for an umbrella organization where we're not necessarily leading everything, but we're trying to promote smaller projects. When I was at the Avichai Foundation, we funded a series starting about 5-6 years ago of initiatives around blended learning, schools that were engaged in blended learning. Blended learning is really code for bringing an online component, synchronous or asynchronous, into your school. And at the moment, I'm sure some of you are aware of it, there are 2 schools in the New York area, one Yeshiva Hatid, the other Westchester Torah Academy, that at least so far seem to be reasonably, if not very successful examples of ways that you can cut tuition in half. And very much to your point, that wasn't, Avichai as a funder funded a whole series of initiatives. If Avichai had to choose one, I'm not sure they would have thrown all their resources behind an effort to cut tuition in half, right? But there were people on the ground, an organization called Affordable Jewish Education, and a lot of individuals very committed to doing that. I'll add, just because these things are always very nuanced, right, that similar efforts in other types of communities might not have worked, right? So Teaneck, Bergen County, New Jersey, in particular, Westchester to a lesser degree, where these 2 schools respectively are based, are growing Jewish communities and Orthodox communities. So you have a built-in demand for the seats. But it's a very profound point. It's subtle, but I think profound point, which is that very often smaller entities, individual schools, individual camps, can take risks that large organizations can't take. And I think the key is, back to your question, that as a funder or as a larger nonprofit, the innovation comes in your willingness to say, great, we're going to try a few things, we're going to see what's working, and we're going to keep fueling the things that are working, large or small.
Sounds great. I've also noticed that being bold in our messaging has been really successful and really powerful. That one of the core messages of ORA, and a message that we were initially one of the few people out there saying, is that get refusal is a form of domestic abuse, that it's about power and control and about coercive control. And we were very deliberate in how we communicated that. Get refusal is a form of domestic abuse, period. We didn't say the argument could be put forth that get refusal might possibly actually fit into this model. We were very bold and explicit. And I've just noticed this kind of anecdotally, but I've been at ORA 6 years. When I first started, that was really a new message. There was a lot of pushback from pretty mainstream people. There's a lot of crazy people on the internet, so you're never going to win everybody, but you would really get, kind of regular, thoughtful people pushing back, and we would have a lot of dialogue, maybe on our Facebook page, in person, at events, where we would explain why we were connecting get refusal to domestic abuse, why it was about coercive control, etc. And I've noticed that now we don't have to do that anymore. If we have a Facebook post and someone says, well, how can you say it's domestic abuse? You come back an hour later and 30 other people are already responding with all of our message points. If we speak at an event and someone pipes up, there's someone else in the audience arguing back with them with, again, all of the core aspects of our message. And so I think that sometimes just putting it out there, taking the pushback initially, because as stressful that pushback might be, if you really believe in what you're saying, it's doable to defend it, even if it's not always easy depending on who you're arguing with. And I see that that's really changed the cultural conversation over time, that now people take it as an assumption that, of course, it's a form of domestic abuse, and that's not an argument we have to make anymore, and we can then move on. We still reiterate that message, but we can move on to kind of more nuances of that message.
We live in a volatile environment that is likely going to amplify struggles of some of the organizations and their ability to, and the social issues that they're addressing. Roughly half of nonprofits say that their organizations are subject to regulatory shocks or policy shifts. And there's also growing competition among nonprofit organizations. What are the ways in our changing world that we'll be able to, what are the things that are going to impact the development, governance, and effectiveness of nonprofit organizations, and how can we think about that and prepare ourselves?
So maybe I'll take one stab at it. So I work for an organization now, as Alyssa mentioned, Prizmah, that's a merger of 5 different organizations. While the day school field fortunately doesn't have the threat of more government regulation, ironically, although interestingly, we probably in some ways, some of the trends toward funding of private schools, particularly in New York State, are probably favorable trends. And as of yet, there's been no meaningful effort to regulate, at least that I'm aware of. But I think looking at opportunities to collaborate and to merge is an area that gets a lot of, people talk about a lot. But my experience in a organization that's the result of a 5-way organization merger is that was really that was disruptive innovation, in the sense that we really became the central address for Jewish day schools, and funders that, in terms of competition, I worried initially, even with this new organization, that in fact there are lots of regional competitors. Many boards of Jewish ed on a local level offer many of the services that each of these 5 organizations offered nationally. So I said, well, it's great to bring 5 organizations together, but there are 15 or 20 major cities that do a lot of the same types of fee-for-service programs or grant-funded programs. The reality is, when you go out and you're one united organization with everyone working together, the funders start recognizing that, oh, I have a central address for an issue. And so in a sense, the competition starts slowly kind of going away. I'm not sure that's so good for the day schools necessarily, but from an organizational perspective and from a donor perspective, it lessens the duplication of overlap of resources.
Isn't that contra to what you guys just talked about with innovation of smaller organizations?
Right, but as I said, it's an umbrella organization, right? A lot of the innovation, to be candid, it can come from us, but a lot will come from the 300 day schools individually, right? Very often our best ideas are ones that we see happening at a school, and our role is to accelerate that and to find the funding to roll it out on a big scale. Not buying it.
I think, as you think about, the world is not only changing, it is changing faster, right? There's a lot of research around how cities traditionally become much more innovative than towns. You just have a tinier, tighter, denser population of ideas, and people build upon those ideas very quickly. And just the widespread adoption of both the internet and collaborative conversations happening on the internet means that your cities, your sort of theoretical cities, are getting larger and tighter and more involved, and so people are improving faster. The world is changing faster than it used to, right? Which is, and I really identify with one of the things that Keshet talked about in her work, which is what I think of as like the role of sense-making for nonprofit organizations, which is we have a wildly complicated world, and our minds are just like desperate for some frameworks. And I think, there are a few events in our lives, September 11th, the election of Donald Trump, some of the larger historic level hurricanes, where the feeling is, and these are all not sort of the same events, but the world is different than we thought it was. Right? We didn't think X was possible, and then it happened. And so, what does that mean? We were just collectively wrong as a country, and trying to identify how does the world work now, and what do we need to know about it, is one of the leading roles for organizations. And you talked about sort of the way you've shifted frameworks, and that will be true regardless of whether you're in higher ed or health or whatever you may be in. I think that's a really important role.
Absolutely, and I think for us, there's definitely less funding than there used to be in the area of domestic abuse work, legal aid, all of these areas, and there's definitely more stress and competition, and you feel that. Our overall goal, I have no interest in replicating a program that's already being run and being run well, so if there is a real overlap in competition, then I think we would move out of a space to let someone else, if someone else is doing it and doing it well, I don't need to fight with them over that patch of land when there's so much to do. Of course, there's stress, and I think we try to manage that as best we can. I will generally, if we start a new program, I'll try to go out for coffee with anyone who I think will be upset about the program, so I can just speak to them and really talk through if they have concerns or they feel like this is in their territory or this is going to compete with certain funding. Let's talk about it. People, I think, do much better if they know in advance that the program's coming than if they just get a mass email and have a panic attack because it seems similar or something like that. And so we try to do our best to manage that as much as we can, but we really want to have good relationships with everyone. I think in general, we feel like everyone can usually do something for us and something to help us. And so we want to keep good relationships with them. We want to hear whatever their concerns are and try to work with them. And, it's definitely overall a challenge. I think it's so interesting hearing what you're talking about in terms of some of these giving trends and the future, because in the moment, it definitely feels often like there's like a little tiny pod and then 15 people trying to get in there. And so we do our best to participate in that as graciously as possible, but it's a challenge.
And this is my last question. I'm going to turn it over afterwards to the audience. In what ways do we expect the nature of philanthropy to evolve with our changing world? And how can we be there to position ourselves?
Sure, I can start. I think a lot of historians will tell you that demographics are destiny, and you see this a lot in the difference between what's happening in Japan right now, where you have a sort of an aging population, very low birth rates, very little immigration, and innovation slowing down pretty dramatically, versus Indonesia, for instance, fourth largest country in the world, maybe fifth, and has sort of tremendous young people and tremendous potential. There's obviously a lot of differences in those cultures, but who lives in that time and how old they are and how they're thinking about the world is pretty different. There's sort of two great trends demographically happening in the United States right now. The first is more focused on, which is sort of the rise of millennials into adulthood and what that means. You have later marriage rates, you have different expectations of the workforce, you have people coming in without the ability to buy homes in very difficult housing markets and what that looks like. And a lot of people focus on millennials. And then boomers are also, sort of the aging of boomers is sort of tremendously different than the last 20 years. And you have something close to twice as many people turning 71 years old this year compared to last year, right? And we have a sense that the population is sort of flat. It's not. It looks like huge baby boom, Gen X is relatively small, and huge millennial population, which are the children of baby boomers. And so what does the world look like when 73 million people are over 65? And it is a very different sphere. It probably means that volunteerism is going to go up. It probably means that annual giving is going to go down as those people retire and start thinking a little bit more conservatively about their assets and the lack of income. It means that planned giving is going to be a dramatic force. And it means that there's just like this vast untapped wisdom from people that no longer want to work full time, but can do more than build houses with Habitat, but are accountants and lawyers and financiers or teachers or nurses or doctors who can play some role. And I don't know that any organization has really captured the intellectual capability of that generation yet. But I'm sure that someone will figure out in the next 5 years.
I mean, I'll add a ditto to what Patrick said. I think a lot about the millennials and also the notion of being less wedded to institutions, which is, I think, a theme for a lot of us that work in the Jewish nonprofit world, right? It feels like there's less loyalty to institutions. It's more of a virtual world. It's experiential. The great news is for innovators like fundme.com or Kickstarter, right? That people like me that are old school who believed giving was based on relationships, and you couldn't possibly really develop a relationship over the internet. The evidence is really strongly to the contrary. So it's probably a wake-up call for a lot of organizations that the millennials are potentially going to be looking at funding things, more things, different things that they may not need as many personal touches. At the same time, and I've sort of, maybe anecdotal, but I get the sense that the giving at the top is becoming more and more concentrated. Whether it's George Soros putting $18 billion into, I knew he had 10 billion, I didn't know he had 18 billion, into his foundation, right, or Gates, and you sort of wonder, will there be mergers? Will there be these giant philanthropic mergers, so that we're dealing with fewer large funders, right, with a whole different set of funding ramifications. So it does feel like the next 5, 10, 20 years is going to see much more change in this area than the last 5, 10, 20 years did.
I think that's all great. I have probably more questions than answers, but
Yeah.
One trend that we've noticed, and especially working with a lot of different, especially Jewish women's organizations, going to, women's philanthropy programs, et cetera, there seems to be a real shift in everyone wanting to work on systemic change and no one wanting to fund direct services, which makes a lot of sense. Who doesn't want to just change the infrastructure of the world so that it's better and we don't have the problems in the future? But there seem to be really growing gaps in direct services, and I find that I can start 15 new programs and get funding for them. I mean, that's putting it a little more generously, but it is so much easier to do that than to fund the day in, day out direct services, which is also often where the greatest need is and where the most direct impact is. So I think I really worry about the future of just direct services, and so many people are saying, I don't want to fund it, that someone has to fund it or the services are going to dry up. I think also we think a lot about just the age of information and how much information we're all encountering, and how do we communicate with people in a way that, grabs their attention but doesn't jump out of the screen, in an obnoxious way. And, if we put out a video, I'm worrying about if someone's scrolling on Facebook, what is coming up in the first 4 seconds, because otherwise they're going to keep going down. And I think that balance between being very honest and being nuanced in our messages, with certain basic principles, not necessarily, but overall it's a complicated issue. It's a hard issue to fully communicate in just a quick soundbite while also getting people's attention. And I think the last point I'll mention is that I've noticed, as you were saying, Patrick, that a lot of people want to be involved. They're moving away from that model of just writing a check and putting it in a pre-stamped envelope, but they also have very limited time. So the question is, how do I get you involved when you only have maybe an hour tops, but I also don't want you to do something that's going to end up being counterproductive, and trying to find just meaningful ways for people to be involved with the limited time that they have, but the interest that they have. Because once they have active involvement, then there's investment, and then funding's much more likely to follow. So I don't really have answers necessarily, but those are all things that we think about a lot.
Those were great questions, and really encapsulates, I think, the challenges of what every nonprofit is looking at and seeing today. So thank you, that was wonderful. I'll take 1 or 2 questions from the audience.
Yeah, I have a problem. I haven't heard one person describe what a charity is properly. You all say it's a nonprofit. Nonprofit is a prelude to bankruptcy. What you're really talking about is a not-for-profit. That's very important.
Yeah.
Because if you're a nonprofit, you will be bankrupt. Now, I don't say you have to make millions of dollars. You have to make $1 more than you spend. Now, that's very important. Most people don't understand that. Secondly, most people don't understand that the greatest donor that not-for-profits have is the government. Yet all, I shouldn't say all, many not-for-profits take advantage of this thing illegally. They don't want to pay back, they don't want to pay sales tax. If you look at your not-for-profits, your fringe benefit rates are the highest there are anywhere. Just look at them. Look at a normal business and look at what you people do. Now my point is, if you looked at the business that you're running at a not-for-profit, a lot of this stuff you'd be doing, you wouldn't do. So you're going to say, people will not get the advantage. Fine. Find out why they won't get the advantage. The advantage is not to rip off somebody else. You look at many of your organizations, and I won't name them here because I'll be embarrassed, and one person knows me for a long time. A lot of businesses, a lot of major not-for-profits refuse to go after what's called the small donor. Their fundraising departments go after the millionaires. What about the little guys? Every one of you probably went to college. Now let me ask you a question. When was the last time you got a letter from your college asking for money? Probably never.
Mine came
Like
last
they
week.
go through all these things, right? Take a look at almost every university. Some of them are much smarter. They have tremendous alumni organizations that go
Right.
after the guy.
I want to.
Let me just add one thing.
Can I respond to one thing you said?
I'll stop. I don't know anything about that.
No, I think an excellent point you raised, frankly, was that organizations that perpetuate themselves, right? One of the so I was, Keshet. I also find myself. Keshet alluded to. Great. If there's someone else servicing it, we don't need to compete with them. Right? You have to always be mindful, and I think all of us in this field, remind ourselves regularly, if there's someone else doing it, we don't need to be doing it. And to ask yourselves, are we serving the greater good here? I've been on boards of organizations where I did think, do we really need to be doing this, or are we just self-perpetuating ourselves? So,
actually,
one thing, if I may, and I won't get into my own personal thing. There are organizations out there, and I'll just give you one, Charity Navigator. I personally will not give a gift to anybody unless I check Charity Navigator. And what am I looking for? In other words, if this organization, its mission is to serve black kosher meat for Rottweilers, I got no problem with that. I make a decision, I want to do it, I don't want to do it. But I want to know, why don't they have an auditor? Why don't they file a 990? Why is the chief executive officer of that organization making $2 million a year? I believe that everyone should make $100 a week, but $2 million a year for an organization that's in deficit.
Thank you. I just want to thank you. I just want to leave time for other people also to ask questions. Yes.
You've all said such fascinating things, and there could be many questions, but one for Patrick and Keshet, you maybe touched on this a little bit, is the last mile. In technology, they often speak about you create these technology infrastructures, but how does it get to the customer? So you have this fabulous idea, you're doing, FreeWill, I'm sitting here, I'm listening. How do you actually then get it to the customer?
So I think similar to some of the, a lot of, we talk about sort of curiosity or experimentation. The important thing is to remember to do that everywhere. And the same is true in you'll do it in program development, you'll do it in fundraising, you'll do it in hiring, right? So we sort of experiment with how to best hire people and try to improve on that over time. In this case, we have two direct avenues, and we've tried others that haven't worked. The two that worked are, one, finding people that actively are looking to do estate planning right now, and they don't have to be looking to do charitable giving. We say, here, this is as good, if not better, than the other options, and it's totally free. And if you go through this, and then people through that process will consider, really consider their philanthropic giving. Many people don't give, many do, but it's about 6 times higher than a typical process. And so that's one, and we've tried 3 other things that don't work. And then also we work with nonprofit organizations, and they share the tools with their own donors. And so they have distribution mechanisms that we don't have access to, but then it generates potentially millions of dollars for that organization while providing a service to the donor. And we're very fortunate to be able to solve a problem by solving another problem. But that's, we've tried 6 or 7 other things that don't work. And it is not our job to convince people that they need to do it if they don't want to be using the service that way.
Yes.
I just want to say I'm Lenore Richter. My husband was involved with the student struggle for Soviet Jewry. So was I, and we were one of the few organizations that he's very proud went out of business because in 1989 the doors to the Soviet Union opened up, and so he said, "I'm going to do it," and he really did it. I'm now involved with several yeshivas, primarily Yeshiva town of Manhattan on the west side. So I came here, and I really think you guys said a lot of wonderful things, and I really wish that we'd all come together and then have more time to share. I mean, I'd like to hear from all of you again about many of the things you said, because I think you really touched on many, many important areas in terms of not just fundraising, but reaching people. Because a lot of times it isn't fundraising that you want to do to change the world, but you want to reach people and share your ideas to make something work. So my point is a big thank you.
Also,
Continue.
just add to that, we also very much hope to go out of business, and that's our goal with the prenup. If everyone signs it, we're not going to need it, and we can all find one of the many other problems in the world to spend our time and attention on.
So thank you very much, and I think just want to end by saying, and I think you raised something very important. This is just an hour of time, and I couldn't be more grateful to our panelists who are here, and really just for the great forward-thinking, insightful, innovations in the way they've prompted us all to think. And I know at Yeshiva University we are hoping to have long friendships with all of you and to keep the conversation going. And we'll see where we take it from there. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming.